everyone to another Legal Tech Talks. My name is Frances Anderson and I'm the MD of NetLaw Media. Today I'm delighted to welcome a Fireside Chat where we'll be looking at levelling up your law firm against advanced phishing threats, which will be introduced by John Granger. Now, John Granger is the Chief Technology and Information Officer at CTIO101.com. John has worked in the business technology area for the last 30 years on both sides of the consulting table. During that time, he's built up a great alumni of colleagues who have some fantastic stories to tell and some insights to share. Since 2017, John has worked as a CTIO in the legal sector, both consumer and corporate global corporate markets. This session will last an hour with questions being brought in throughout, so please don't be shy, come in and join us. And as you're aware, you may see that this session is live and it will be recorded. So if you've got any questions for John or Jack, put the questions through the Q&A, and again, we'll ask your question to the individual panelists, or if you put it through chat, we will be monitoring this and bring you in. So now, without further ado, John, it's over to you.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you for a very generous introduction there. I think the star of the show this evening or this afternoon is going to be our esteemed colleague, Jack Chapman, who is the Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Egress. Now, Jack, we did say that you'd give yourself a bit more of an intro, but I know that I'm broadcasting from London, you're broadcasting from Cheltenham. Do you want to just give us and the folks listening a little bit about your background?
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you all, and I'm looking forward to sort of what we're going to be digging into. So a lot of my background and sort of my current mission is really about understanding the criminal landscape, and most importantly, where it's going in the next couple of years, monitoring the evolving techniques, looking at how sort of everything from the beginning of the kill chain, focusing on that reconnaissance, through to the delivery mechanisms around email and other channels are sort of really moving at quite a fast pace in the threat landscape, which is exciting from a technical point of view, but quite worrying from a defense point of view.
Indeed. And I think we've got a few questions structured around that for this session. And as Francis says, we'll try and make this as interactive as possible, folks who want to post in questions as we go. But Jack, we did have a bit of a prep beforehand, and one of the things we talked about was what we're calling the first rule of SOC Club, which is obviously stolen from Fight Club. So do you want to just talk through the first rule of SOC Club, from your perspective, and then we could just sort of set the scene for everyone for the rest of the fireside chat?
Absolutely. I hope everyone knows the reference where you don't talk about SOC Club. And it's important for quite a few reasons, really, where obviously communication is key. However, if we are outwardly communicating to attackers how we're defending and what our processes are internally, we're giving them the book on how to attack us. And this is where it's a very hard balance, I think, where you need some communication to bring organizations along with us on this cybersecurity journey we're going on. But at the same time, you don't want to advertise your crown jewels, your protections, and all of the layers within that. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, John.
Well, I was just going to say that actually sort of the prime social engineering opportunity is to present yourself as a security specialist and ask about, what's set up. So I think what we're saying is for this session, we're going to keep it at generalities and for everyone who's listening to sort of keep it at that level so we don't inadvertently reveal anything. So, okay, phishing, Jack, phishing 101. Been around for a long time. My question to you was, what in your research, what is the first ever documented phishing event? And we'll see between the two of us who can go back the furthest. But over to you first.
So for me, there's two key things here. One, really, what is phishing? Phishing is manipulating manipulating people with malicious intent, really is what it boils down to. It's a very high level, fluffy definition. And this is through email, but really it goes down to people and targeting people at the forefront of any attack. And that's been around for thousands of years. People have manipulated people throughout history. The only thing that's really changed is we're now doing it through email, and that's the primary piece. So from my recollection, the first real charge on it when I don't think it was even called phishing, was in the AOL days back in the 90s, where you've got sort of the Juarez groups who sort of going around creating fake credentials in order to harvest accounts and cause trouble. Can you go further back than that, John?
So no, I think you're absolutely right from an email point of view. And then before that, you've got folks who just over the phone would be able to get information off of you just by maybe pretending to be someone else. The earliest documented event I went for was very specific, but be worried about specific dates on the internet. So I haven't checked all the sources. But apparently April the 24th, 1184 BC is the date that the Trojan horse defeats the state of Troy. But rather disappointingly, as I was doing that research, Jack, there's a recent view from Oxford University that says actually that was probably a myth. And sadly, that horse never existed. So I'd have to doff my cap back to you in terms of the first recorded phishing event. So, okay, so that's just a bit of history, a bit of context, get everyone sort of relaxed into it. And again, if anyone we are going to be looking at some sort of advanced modes of attack later on in our session. So again, Jack, this is a bit of a key one for everyone to get their heads around. You have to be alert all the time, but by definition, that's really difficult to be, because alert by its nature is a relative state, of heightened awareness. But there are particular times of years where phishing is more prevalent, would you say, in terms of volume? I don't know about success rate, but certainly there are seasonal variations. Would you want to talk a little bit about what you see and what those key moments in the calendar present themselves, in terms of being sort of maybe more volume or more vulnerability to a phishing attempt?
Absolutely, and we're going into one of those periods at the moment where it sort of all kicks off with Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, building up towards sort of the Christmas holidays. And it's the unfortunate truth that an attacker will take something which has pure intent, which is meant for good, for spending time with family, and weaponize that. And what we see is quite a stark increase in attacks. And a lot of people often think of this, it's sort of attacker to consumer, it's not targeting businesses. But the data doesn't back that up. It's shown that the attacks are across the board, targeting people as individuals, which can cause sort of risk towards organizations, because there's always a blurred line between the two. But it's also the case that for businesses where more people are on leave, more sort of less communications are occurring in a clearer manner. Christmas parties are a great example of targeting sort of the morning after. And we see sort of these sort of human-focused attacks sort of really increase. And I think one thing that has changed in this space is the automation of these Christmas attacks, where especially following sort of the news cycle of how fast new attacks are being spun up to match it, where in previous years and sort of especially looking back 3, 4, 5 years ago, they're quite generic, where nowadays they are becoming more personalized to businesses and these sort of these events such as the Christmas holidays.
And Jack, I think it's worth going through that point again, in the sense that folks who don't realize there's a huge amount of research that goes into the folks who do attacks these days, particularly for, obviously there's going to be volume attacks, sort of the spray and pray approach, but there are, for folks that are very targeted, they will even go down to the point of working out when a Christmas party is occurring, or they might try and, it's quite easy to research when someone's financial year end is, all these sort of cyclical nature. Apologies, the lights are just turned off in the room I'm in. That's the sort of level that we're up against. These are, I don't know what people listening and watching this are thinking about the sort of the image of the person that's behind this. I know there is a stereotypical teenager who's, trying, to maybe do some sort of exercise, see what they can reach. But these are also highly organized criminal gangs, aren't they? Do you want to just give a little bit about the sort of folks that are doing this? And I'm going to stand up and sit down, everyone, so I can get the lights to switch back on again. Over to you, Jack.
Thanks, John. It's probably, you raised a good sort of stereotype there of that sort of typically sort of teenager in his bedroom with a hoodie. And if there's any stereotype I wish we could get rid of, it's this one, because the truth of the matter is entirely different. You have very well organized criminal groups, often working out of WeWorks with whiteboards, with SWOT analysis of potential targets. And it's all very business driven. It's all very data led. They've got KPIs on success for basically quarters, a bit like a lot of organizations do. And at the end of the day, they do what works. It's predominant of these cyber attacks outside of hacktivists or some nation state elements. It's all about the money. And there's a lot of ways they can monetize, which I'm sure come on to shortly. But the truth of the matter is these attackers know that if they spend 5 minutes scraping some social media accounts, and in order to get that next bit of insight, they can double, triple, quadruple their chance of success in these attacks, which for them is a no-brainer.
Yeah, and again, it's either going to be a surprise or people are going to be nodding their heads watching this. But the fact it is an industry, and there is literally business models, and there is even sort of estimates as to how big. I don't really want to call it an industry because that sort of suggests there's some sort of legitimacy to it. But there is a huge amount of activity in the sort of extortionist frame. Okay, so I think before we obviously we're going to talk about technology. There's a bit of a clue in the title, and I'm not too sure what you think of this phrase, but I've heard it many times, which we talk about the challenge within either the carbon or the silicon. But I think with phishing and with all of these sorts of elements that have social engineering, there is a huge part of it, which is human nature and how things are engineered before you get into the sort of the security and technology elements. So why do you think, what's inherent in us as humans to fall for some of these? I was sort of going to say dodgy emails, but I know they're getting more and more sophisticated. They're being very, very well written. There used to be some things which you could see misspelling, et cetera, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. But what's the sort of human element of this, first of all, before we start getting into the sort of the technical? I know there might be a crossover as well between the two, Jack.
Yeah, I think it's the unfortunate truth that we as humans aren't designed very well to spot phishing emails. I mean, looking at some of our core sort of behavioral science processing loops, there's sort of quite a well-known element called System 1 and System 2 thinking, where System 1 is sort of fast, it's your day-to-day, it's low energy. If I asked you where you lived or your name, you wouldn't have to think very hard on that. On the other side, we've got System 2, which is sort of if I asked you what a 100th decimal of pi was, other than some potentially very odd looks I might get, you'd have to really stop, consider, pull out a calculator and slow down. And part of the challenge we have, especially with these more sophisticated, successful phishing attacks, is that they're targeting this behavioral science, where they're essentially forcing people to stay in sort of the first system by use of emotive language, by trying to keep people in an emotively heightened state of fear, greed, the baser human instincts. And what this means is humans can't fall back on their training as much as they need to, because they're not thinking that way. They're not thinking, oh, what do I need to check here? They're active instinctively. And what's more, there's a term called cognitive narrowing. And it really is the case that humans get caught up in the moment, especially with the context switching, especially with mobile phones late at night. It's incredibly difficult for humans as a layer in and of itself to be the solution to this. Yeah. So it's an uphill battle.
Jack, I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but this is how I think of it sometimes, which is a bit like if you're ever lucky enough to see very close magic, sort of, where it's just down to the hand is faster than the eye. And well, I don't want to spoil it for everyone, but I don't think there's any children watching, but that it's skill that you're seeing. It's not magic. But even though you know that and you're watching the magician's hands as closely as possible, you still can't see the trick. And sometimes I think social engineering kind of plays into that part of your brain, or you're like you say, that's the System 1, sometimes called the lizard. You're just in that kind of act mode, or they've created a situation where you're worked up, so they're trying to get you into that response mode. So your logic brain is getting quieter. But I'm just saying, it is almost impossible on its own to mitigate against, because it is just to be human.
Absolutely. And I think there's quite a lot of danger here, especially with some biases we have as humans. I know for myself, I've got a security background, I've got a sort of IT background. I'm thinking, oh, could anyone phish me? It's sort of that bit of arrogance, to put it bluntly, and I own that. And the answer is yes, absolutely, because we're all fallible. You hear quite often of sort of people leading large cybersecurity conferences or organizations, and we can all be phish. We just need to be caught out at the wrong moment with the right content, and that's it. And an interesting trend we're seeing here quite often when we talk about phishing attacks, we're thinking, oh, my mum or grandma would fall for that. But especially some of the sort of younger people we have in our workforces, because they grew up with this technology, they face a whole different range of attacks they would fall for, which is quite an interesting divide that we're seeing.
So, Jack, I wanted to introduce, actually, you just made me think of something there. So what we're trying to, I think what we're conveying to everyone who's watching this is this can happen to anyone. And so when we start to get into some of the recommended approaches, etc., I was looking quite recently at a sort of concept called psychological safety. And they were talking about teams with a high level of psychological safety is basically a team that's prepared to put their hand up and say, I've made a mistake. Where that doesn't exist, where there's fear, where folks won't say, I've put my hand up, they kind of looked at those two groups and came up with entirely different results. And basically, the group that was more akin to saying, I've made a mistake, over time had less instances of errors, and because they were able to report and learn from it. So I'm just wondering whether there's, early days, I've read the emails from security about, what will happen if you click on the link and all the rest of it. But do you think this is important for folks to create the right kind of environment so that things don't get hidden? Someone clicks on a link and then does nothing about it because they're very worried. What would you think? I won't say best practice, because best practice literally means best in the world. But what would you say is good practice around that kind of approach?
Absolutely. I think it's something we don't talk about enough is our cybersecurity culture. And it's definitely an evolving element in every organization of what direction are we going in. But I think it's important to bring people along, not just for the fact that it makes for a better work environment, makes people more open to new initiatives. But at the end of the day, it's about results. So when I'm looking especially at phishing attacks, prevention is the best methodology. Ideally, we prevent every attack, but we all know that will never happen. Regardless of how many layers we add in, someone will get through some of those layers. And for me, one of the most powerful elements is for someone to put their hand up and say, I made a mistake. So that means the time to respond goes from potentially months, where someone has infiltrated your systems, moving laterally and all of the quite scary things further down the kill chain, to, cool, we'll wipe your laptop, we'll reset your passwords, and we'll monitor those associated with you. So the stress on teams decreases. You raised a really important point there, I think, where actually, if we can make everyone in the organization 1% more aware of cyber threats, they can feel they can step forward. They understand why these processes we're putting in place actually help their jobs and not hinder them.
Yes.
I think that will help our budgets, but also our operational capabilities as well.
Cool. So, Jack, I'm keeping track of a few points you've made so I can come back to them, like, the monetization, etc. But I'm also want to be responsive to questions that we're getting. So we've just had our first question in, and it's talking about the size of, in fact, someone sort of said that phishing attacks, that global market's estimated to be $10 billion, according to a quote from one of the sources. And the question is, do you think email providers should do more to filter out these emails? I suppose, obviously, this is talking about the email vector, because there are other ways in which you can be socially engineered. But for the email vector, is there more? It says what they should do. I suppose there's also an element of what they can do. So we might get into a little bit of that in the technology arms race. But just to answer that question, what do you think is, are email providers doing what they can, or do you think there's a gap there?
I think they're doing what they can. It's the unfortunate truth from an attacker's point of view. If you take Microsoft, for example, it's one of the largest email platforms in the world. if an attacker can't get past Microsoft security, they're not going to be earning much money. That is the lowest bar. The other challenge these organizations have is the fact that they aren't security companies inherently. They're trying to bring security in, and that's not their top mission. Their top mission is to add value in productivity tools and other elements. And there's always going to be conflict between those, as we know when we're trying to set up sort of security solutions for organizations in general. But looking at their roadmaps, they continuously try and innovate forward. One of the challenges we have is the fact that the attackers are simply innovating faster. And that's a hard truth to accept.
Sure. And then we're going to get into that. I think we called that the sort of technology arms race. But before we do, and just reference to the 10 billion that was mentioned there, and actually I've heard 20 billion for ransomware as a global market, for example. So it's just a eye-wateringly large amounts of money here. Let's talk about monetizations, because the folks that are watching this are understanding, okay, it's easy to be tricked. It's part of our human nature. It's being targeted. We've got a vulnerability. But I think also, to really help people understand, what are these folks using their, what are they doing? How are they making money out of this? And again, apologies, I'm going to have to keep standing up because I'm on some sort of timer switch. Go for it, Jack.
No, it's John. I think one of the big things to understand from the criminal ecosystem is that it's inherently changed from 5-10 years ago. The thing that's really driving it is the fact that specialization now exists. You've got the piece where you've got the data scientists who will take public data breaches and apply data science techniques, so you get targeted lists pre-ready made. You've got those who will create the ransomware but won't deliver it themselves because they earn a lot of money and a safety net away from federal agencies who might be investigating them. And what this leads to is a very large black market with credentials. The number one sort of traded asset currently is an Office 365 account credential. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, using that one credential, I can go and phish 10 other people. This compromised account sort of network across organizations. What this does mean from an attacker methodology point of view is the use of aging accounts where an attacker would purchase a domain, park it for a couple of years, as kind of disappearing in the sort of larger scheme, because that's a lot of work and costs money. Where if I can compromise John and use his account, which is trusted, it's several years old, it's not been on any block lists, it makes sense. And this is the big shift we're starting to see, which sort of touched on sort of some of the traditional security solutions struggle with, because that was what was inherently called safe before. And I think to add to that, one of the big challenges actually is, in reality, not only are sort of attackers selling these sort of specialized solutions to allow less sophisticated attackers to act, I, as a more mature attacker, could go and purchase a set of credentials for one of my target companies. Rather than having to do that entryway myself, I suddenly skip a lot of the early pain in order to get to where I want to be. So both sides benefit.
Yeah, Jack, what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the gold rush in sort of the early 19th century in America, which is, the folks who made a lot of money in the gold rush were the folks selling buckets and spades and boots. The folks that went up and mined, that was a lottery sort of position. And it sounds like what you're saying is these buckets and spades and equipment is readily available now for folks to take. They're making that's I suppose creating the industry, because this, again, that cliched view that you need to be incredibly clever and sort of gifted to be able to crack into a system, that's no longer the case, because these things are sort of available sort of commercially, albeit via the dark web, I assume, or some other means that isn't sort of via eBay or obviously not via eBay, just to say that for the record. But is that the case? Is it that easy?
It really is, I think. And the worrying thing is how the price point has dropped on sort of the less sophisticated goods. So it's almost like a second-hand car market, where the original very sophisticated templates from sort of 2017, 2018 can now pick up for sort of $50, $100. and I can go and purchase 10,000 email accounts for a couple of hundred.
Yeah.
And from that, and I think the worrying thing, just to put it into context, is when you look at corporate websites with formal SLAs and FAQ sections, the criminals have that as well. I looked at some of these sort of darknet sites, and I felt like I was in Canary Wharf. It was very professional, very driven, and that sort of reflects again on the types of people doing this.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So let's get into a little bit on the technology arms race, for and against, if you like. So, I mean, you were mentioning some of these sort of phishing packs that can be bought. I've heard of the phrase ransomware as a service, or just, whatever the attack is as a service, tagged on the end. Where I was coming from on the technology arms race was, I was really trying to pick out the arms race element of it. So if you take machine learning and potentially even artificial intelligence, obviously it's a tool that can be used in any context. And I'm just wondering whether you're seeing evidence of that first off being developed and used by the folks doing the attacks before we get into the defense.
Yeah, so AI, machine learning, deep learning, and the sort of a large amount of terms which have been bandied around in sort of this area. So I think there's two key sides here. One of which you mentioned earlier, John, where attackers are targeting security solutions. Attackers are targeting AI directly now, where it's a lot easier to poison an AI system, i.e., give it fake data in order to train it to see that bad is actually normal, so accept it all. And I think it's one of the challenges we have in the industry, where for too long vendors have said, oh, it's a black box, it just works, it's magic, and all of these other terms. And the reality is an attacker can actually turn that from an organization's greatest asset to a huge liability.
Crikey, this is really profound, I think, because one of the phrases I use when you have a piece of technology like that, which requires specialist skills, not just in one profession. Actually, I think with AI, it's across quite a few multidisciplinary approaches that I learned recently, and that's that you're really looking at alien technology. The folks that are using it, like you say, the black box, don't really understand fundamentally how it works. And it's working on the basis, I think, in some instances, of creating a pattern. And that pattern is something it refers to, and it updates that pattern incrementally over time. Okay. Attempting to describe a little bit of AI in 30 seconds, which is a bit difficult. But what you're saying is they understand that. And so that pattern potentially is there to throw out a fraudulent pattern. But if they change that so that is now a good pattern, they're almost just pasting their way into the systems without being detected. They're sort of creating a positive pattern that the system wouldn't flag up. I mean, that's going in really deep. I mean, I'm just thinking like 95% of folks who use stuff like this wouldn't have a clue about the nature of that kind of attack. So using machine learning comes with it a huge amount of responsibility.
Exactly. And one thing to point out is AI has potential to revolutionize security. We've seen a lot of benefits from that. I mean, the days where we're not having to go in and manually update YAML rules sort of every hour on the hour, and it's got the potential to be so good. But unfortunately, attackers have realized this, so they're changing their TTPs to address this. And in terms of what's happening, you mentioned sort of the gold rush metaphor, and what we see is chatter between these ecosystems and when they're advising how to break different models and reverse engineering them. And I think for me, what I recommend is, especially when you're scrutinizing these systems, don't be afraid to ask some of the core questions, because we talk about AI for security, but for me, let's ask a question around security for AI, of how do you prevent an attacker sort of attacking this directly? How robust is this? How will this change over time? And some of these core questions, you don't necessarily have to be an expert in, but you sort of get a sense of what's going on. And if someone just says it's a black box, it will solve all your life's pain, probably not.
Yeah. And I just darting back to the question we had earlier about email. and email providers, but just think about email in itself. I'm not going to say what year it was the first time I sent an email, but it was a long time ago, and I was properly amazed. Went from the UK to someone in Hong Kong, and I was just absolutely bowled over by it. But that now I think there's certain things I would never do on email. Certain transactions I would just say, do you know what? I'm not going to do this unless I'm authenticated in a walled garden, in a portal, with everything up and running. Or actually, I'd like to do this in person, that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering whether folks, we take people that aren't technical and choose not to be technical, can take some of this for granted and maybe don't realize, how vulnerable certain modes of communication are. So I was just wondering what your view is on where we could end up with email, because I think if the arms race, if it goes the wrong way, I can see kind of business email becoming like a liability, a bit like sometimes when you get a lot of junk texts messages, or it sort of devalue that kind of means. And it gives us such utility in business. Email is such a useful thing to have. I just get worried that as a category it might become a difficult medium to keep going. I'm not talking about obviously in the coming months, but over the longer term. So what's your view on that? Do you think email's going to make it, or do you think we're going to end up doing something different?
I'm always skeptical when I hear about something other than email, just for the simple fact of we've heard that for the last sort of decade, 2 decades of, email is a good starting point, let's move on. But I think the reality is it achieves so much business function, so many things are built on top of it. And I think that's one of the challenges we have on the security side of we're trying to secure what is in effect very old technology now. But for me, I think in some ways it benefits us having that as the primary form of communication, because if that's the largest gate into our organization, that's where we can focus our resources, time and training on that. My worry is if we go away from email in a meaningful way, that's going to become very fragmented. Already we see a lot of organizations using things like Slack and Teams and other multi-channel. And an attacker will just adopt to that the moment that they're not hitting their KPIs in other areas, because they follow the trends, they do what works. So if we're split around 100 different technologies, our jobs as security professionals becomes exponentially harder. But at least in this case, we're on a stable battleground.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. Okay, well, look, we're still in the arms race space, but we're trying to, and everyone who's listening, so Jack and I are going to kind of go through a little bit of the National Cybersecurity Centre recommendations. We're also going to do a little bit on a strong sort of buzzword at the moment, zero trust. And then we're going to try and package up a little bit of a call to action for folks who are interested in things you can do to improve your stance in this space. But just before we get into that, Jack, do you want to talk about a little bit about the sort of the positive technology developments, the stuff we're doing that is to try and, beat the extortionists and everything we've described so far?
Absolutely. I think some of the really positive things we're seeing from quite a few vendors, egress included, is really looking more to the left of the kill chain. Quite often we've been focused on payloads, and because of the sort of negative cybercrime community going towards that more polymorphic, i.e. they can basically spin up new payloads in seconds, they'll look completely differently and do other challenges. But in reality, we ask ourselves the core question of how many ways are there actually in a text format to manipulate someone? The answer is actually, there's not tons and tons. And that's where some really exciting developments with natural language processing and understanding, being able to do sort of behavioral mapping for users, departments and organizations. And the biggest driving force on the defensive side is really context. Because if we have the context of communications, we can start seeing what's good and what's bad. For example, John, you've never been phished by someone asking if you fancy a barbecue this weekend. Whereas if I'm suddenly asking you about financial information and you've never dealt with that in your job role. And these are very sort of absolute methods where normally attacks are in the more gray zone, and that's where smarter technology is important.
You've got me, Jack, you got me worried now, thinking about all the barbecue invitations over the summer. What were they real? So paranoid. So apologies. We had a question earlier, Jack, and because I had the wrong screen open, I missed it. So this is a question around AI, and I think one of the sort of founding philosophers around sort of robots and, just because we can do it, should we do it, sort of thing. Someone called Isaac Asimov. And so the question here is, he had the right idea on the 3 rules. Are those the 3 rules where you do no harm, they're sort of, and they layered over the top? Do you think that those should be implemented on AI Foundation so as to not allow nefarious actions against others? So I think the last part of this question is probably also very relevant, because it said, would that even be possible?
So I think this falls down into what a lot of AI practitioners talk about over drinks, is the concept that we see of advanced AI. Strong AI is the formal definition for it, where you essentially have sentient AI you see in a lot of sci-fi films. Whether it's even possible, whether that can ever exist. And people are on other ends of the spectrum there. I think we're so far away from that being plausible. I think we need to focus more on the short, medium to even long term of we've essentially evolved statistical models to have feedback loops to automate some of that process. I think having some foundations is important, but not so much for the AI itself, but for those creating the AI. I know the National Cybersecurity Centre has got a concept for security by design. And I think that's really important to embed in every AI and security product, because at the end of the day, if the mission is to protect organizations, the last thing you want is to be the door into them.
Yeah. And I think we've got sort of make a bit of a distinction here. We have ventured into AI. It's kind of inevitable when you're talking about security to a certain extent, but we're not suggesting general intelligence by a long stretch. We're probably talking more about machine learning and possibly just sort of on the cusp of an advanced version of quant, which has been around for a long time. But I think just to address that question, an AI episode is something entirely separate. But I think what's really interesting when you look at AI, just how quickly you get into the ethics of it. It appears much quicker than the algorithms and the data and everything else, I think. Would you agree?
I would agree entirely, and I think a lot of privacy officers lose sleep over the direction that this is going in. The fact that these systems can do great things, but they're only as smart as the data that's fed into them. Yeah, and that's a core challenge.
Cool. Okay, so we're doing very well for time, and I've now got the right Q&A box open if anyone asks a question. So apologies for the delay there. On the National Cybersecurity Centre, from my view, you take your advice from as wide a group as possible. Some of it you listen to and absolutely ignore, others that you bring in, but there are some good frameworks, and I think it's really important to have a basis that you can go to. Do you want to talk about the layered approach that's recommended by the centre, and just maybe share some experience, and then we might tip into zero trust at that point, but if not, we'll have a chat about zero trust.
Absolutely. I think at the heart of it, a layered approach is sort of can be applied across all methodologies. And I've had some interesting conversations with the people at the centre, and because it falls back to the fundamental that nothing is infallible, whether it's technology, humans, process and policy. You've got the fact that every single layer can be defeated with enough time and money. But if you can have more layers which are secure, that's going to frustrate attackers. It's going to give you safety nets. It will give you more visibility in where the problems occur. And I think this is where this sort of concept for security, having more layers of security, really comes in. And I recommend anyone who hasn't read the guidance around some of the sort of layered security, read some of the NCSC guidance, because it really is all about sort of managing how someone progresses through those layers, from having your sort of boundary access all the way through to sort of how they're accessing cloud services, presentation, going to the on-prem, like the endpoints. And for me, this can only be a good element. One, because it fits into a lot of our working methodologies already, but it can add further value from that. And I think an opportunity, if you haven't done so already, is really assess how your different security layers and IT layers work together in that. Because quite often it's the gaps between layers that criminals like to target, because traditionally it's been successful.
Sure. So maybe we can get into some specifics, and this might be part of the kind of call to action. So I'm going to throw some fairly random things at you around the recommended approaches, and maybe you can sort of say, John, that makes a massive difference, or no, that's incremental, or actually, John, that's a bit of a myth, that sort of thing. So the first thing I would say is you need to have multi-factor authentication in place sort of immediately. And if you don't have it during this call, you should probably stop watching this webinar and do it immediately. And before we go into that, for those non-technical folks that are listening, multi-factor authentication is effectively having more than one source. It's not just having a password, it's having another means of authenticating you. It might be, people should be very familiar with like a number that appears on their phone in addition to their password. But Jack, I mean, disagree, absolutely. But I'm just thinking practically, that's sort of the one that really hits you in the face if it's missing. It is a very serious vulnerability, particularly based on the email phishing that we were referring to.
Absolutely. Please, yes, please. I hear a couple of arguments against multi-factor authentication at times of, well, we're evaluating which type do we want. And the reality of it, whether it's app-based, text-based, separate hardware-based, biometric-based, anything is far, far better than not having any. The other one I often hear is we're starting to see the trend of crime as a services using things like EvilGenX2 and other attack methods that bypass MFA or weaponize and try and attack MFA directly or scrape the MFA. Those attacks are by far in the minority still, because so many businesses still aren't implementing MFA. So if you can reduce your risk by putting a number out of thin air, about 80%, 90%, why wouldn't you? Especially with the low cost of implementation of some of these technologies versus the benefits. So I'd strongly recommend that.
Maybe we do a bit of a quick old school kind of phishing attempt, which won't be giving away any secrets because this has been out. I mean, everyone's experienced this at some point in their career. So you have an account that's not protected by MFA. The password has been phished. That could just be by calling reception and speaking to the person. I'm from IT, I need you, that sort of phishing, real old school. The email address associated with it's been picked up from something that's published. A publisher to contact me on, whatever. So they've done that. And then they're basically banking on being able to create that account from scratch. And if anyone remembers really early days email, when you used to get a username and password, you used to type into your laptop and then it would just gradually build up with all the content. So that's what they're doing. They're creating another copy of your email. And if you have multi-factor authentication in place, the moment they put in your password, it'll challenge, and that's basically a big point of defense, isn't it? Because without that, your email might be living a dual life, and it might be living a dual life for a long time, whilst folks look at patterns and who's talking to who, and et cetera, et cetera. So, Jack, is that I just want the folks who are watching and listening to understand whether that's a serious scenario and maybe it's something that they should be Googling MFA right now.
It's something we see every day for a lot of our clients where they haven't had this in place. It's led to a data breach. It's led to a couple of months of very hard questions and a lot of very long nights to try and remediate. Just add another benefit for MFA is it's another logging point. So if you do have any seams or sores, failed OAuth attempts or multi-factor authentication attempts are a great sign that someone's trying to attack you. Whereas just login is quite noisy. So it's another potential asset on top of all the other values it brings.
Yeah, because you'd be the hypothesis would be, why are folks doing that and then not putting their number in? You know, it's a better kind of marker, isn't it? Interesting. Okay, well, how about we get into a bit of zero trust?
Yes.
So, would you say zero trust is a bit like digital transformation, in the sense that, you know, some of us have been around for a long time, took a while to get their heads around the word digital and thought, well, that's sort of business technology. And zero trust is kind of, well, is that really new? Because from a security point of view, did we ever really have a model where we trusted everyone? I know there's elements of technology that sort of defaults, because I suppose, again, to the non-technical audience, what I would say is pretty much every bit of technology that a business uses is designed to connect to something. And it's designed to be resilient and to connect to something. It's not designed not to connect. You know, the internet is literally designed to withstand a nuclear war, you know, by keeping connections open between different parts of it. So with that point of view, is zero trust. Do you want to just sort of say what we think zero trust is out there on the streets at the moment, and then whether that's new or not, and also whether there's elements of that as a strategy which folks could take away from this session?
Yeah, I think my biggest pain around zero trust is how it's become a bit another of our cybersecurity buzzwords, where at its heart is a methodology about really assessing the levels of access individuals have, sort of endpoints have, servers have, and how these things work together, most importantly. And at its heart, is it a new thing? 95%, not even 99%, is not new at all. It's things we've talked about and have evolved over time. I think where it is very useful, especially in the email space specifically, is at combating where attackers are exploiting traditionally open authentication paths. So one of the biggest fears a lot of organizations have is around supply chain attacks in email, where, John, we've talked on email, I'm going to compromise John so I can attack Jack because that's a trusted source. Whereas with some zero trust approaches, it would be, let's assess all content blindly and with a high level of scrutiny. And only if it passes that will we allow the connection to occur. So in a lot of ways, the default is no. However, a lot of this really boils down to what works for not only each organization, but each business part. As some business parts, for business reasons, require high level of connection, but quite often a lot of them really don't. And we've seen too many stories where people have left users with admin accounts on for 2 years after they've left the organization. Someone manages to, from an old data breach, get access to that, and bad things occur.
Yeah. So maybe a couple of things to talk about. So the first thing is a VPN. So again, for those folks not technical listening, you might know it stands for virtual private network. You probably hear of it since sort of post-pandemic, working away from the office. It creates this sort of secure connection. But there's that's a very kind of inelegant view of what VPN actually is. And Jack, you know, if I was to say to you, well, I've got a VPN connection, so I'm absolutely fine. Do you want to just maybe reveal a little bit about how, you know, a VPN connection can actually be quite a significant vulnerability source because of what you can do once you're in, because the level at which you enter an organization on a VPN. I'm saying typically, I'm not saying specifically, but that's, I don't know if you see a lot of that.
Yeah, I've sort of seen quite a few cases where actually VPNs, where 99% of the time they were forceful good, they allow us to have control of what used to be behind the great external firewall of organizations, but with all the hybrid working, it become an utter necessity in my eyes. And once again, it gives you more visibility and control over the assets you're responsible for. However, if someone is remote and sort of they're being targeted, as soon as they're onto the VPN, they can access all the other assets within that VPN, depending on controls in place. So it's no different to them being on a work computer in an old-fashioned office, where actually, once you're in one machine, you can move laterally within that. That's where some of the zero trust principles some of the sort of controls in place. So I think it's important not to assume that a VPN is considered a high side environment where nothing can get in, it's secure. It acts like any other network in a way. So
yes.
relevant and security is important there.
And a lateral movement for the non-technical folks listening is coming in on one swim lane and then hopping across to another swim lane and continuing your journey. If you'd started on that swim lane at the beginning, you wouldn't have got in the first place. So it's a bit sort of like going into an office and pretending to be someone, but then once you're in the office, moving into, having free reign to move around the rest of the office. In fact, one of the analogies, Jack, I think, is the analogy about the castle and the keep. And you've got the castle wall, and you've got the traditional protection, which is the wall itself. But then once you're inside, you can then go about pretty much anywhere you like within that castle, and sort of getting lots of smaller rooms, all of which requiring, a check to get into is sort of the sort of segmentation, they call it, or micro segmentation. I don't know if that's the correct phrase, but that's another kind of countermeasure in terms of being able to prevent these sort of lateral movements. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think it's going back to what we talked about email earlier. It's one of the challenges with email where it is so public facing and there's so much trust in it on that internal basis that once that is compromised from a supply chain, from a sort of BC compromised business account, it's very, very difficult for humans to establish that trust. And going back to sort of some of these large email hosts, it's very difficult for them as well, where they're looking at 1 billion email accounts. How can they see that?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to consider how we can address these. And one thing to point out is a lot of these solutions aren't always technical. Sometimes they can be applied through policy of any financial transfers. Pick up the phone, just to add that extra verification, and that can quite often be the solution where the technology would be very incumbent.
Yes. So just on the recommendations again, there's a sort of two elements of it, which we could probably briefly, just cognizant of time, briefly touch upon, which is the monitoring element and the reporting element of it. So I think, you've got the technology countermeasures in place, but you need to have a very significant kind of monitoring capability. And then if you do, maybe we say when you do have an event, you've got yourself a fairly polished and rehearsed incident management process. Ransomware, for example, is one that you probably need to rehearse with quite an interesting group of stakeholders within the business. But do you have anything to share on the sort of the monitoring side or on the reporting side from your experience? Have you been in scenarios? I'm sure you've done sort of gold command type scenarios and stuff like that.
Yeah, I know one thing we do sort of prior to scenarios is always try and map ways into the organization for attacks against kill chain. So for those who don't know what kill chain is, it's essentially the steps an attacker would take from finding who to attack all the way through to succeeding at the other end, past command and control, and sort of successfully exiting, essentially. The reason that's interesting is you soon see where most of your technology, people, and process security is focused. What that allows you to do going from that is when you are doing sort of command and control based sort of scenarios where let's test if we get ransomware, what steps do we have to take? How resilient are we? You're able to know what areas to call upon. So in the ideal case, you can stop these attacks as far left as possible before they even get delivered. But the earlier you can stop it and the faster you can interact with each of those steps, the better. And what we normally see from these scenarios is there's a lot of focus on the detection and prevention, which rightly so, we don't want these bad things in our organizations. But quite often we don't have mechanisms for visibility into further down the kill chain, which is quite dangerous, because if someone does successfully get in, how do you know they haven't moved laterally, as we've discussed before? And I think that leads to the old saying, sort of ghost in the wires. How do you know someone's not sitting in there? And we've seen cases where an attacker will sit dormant for 6-12 months before actioning. Yeah. And that's when it's important to have these continuous monitoring solutions.
Yeah. And I think there's some statistics folks can look up about the average sort of time it takes from beginning to for the kill chain as you describe it. It isn't necessarily a few hours. It can be months or even close to a year in terms of something really concerted. A couple of other things to throw in. First one was the training. You know, we've all been in front of a CBT, computer-based training. I don't even know if that's the term anymore, but it was.
Just to take that over from sort of the computer-based training or software awareness training, so it's called in sort of the email space. I think training is a core pillar for security. We need to bring people with us, explain these threats because they are a key layer to our security. However, far too often I see that is the only layer. And I think that's a real challenge from the point of view of, hang on a second, these people who aren't cyber experts, who aren't IT experts, whose job it is to be helpful and support, who's to deal with clients. And we're putting this all on them there. And especially what we talked about earlier about the type 1, type 2 thinking, it really is the case that training in and of itself is ineffective. And that's where training combined with technical solutions, combined with policy to support them, is really the only way to combat a lot of these sort of human activated risks, these sort of email-based attacks. So I'm not saying throw all of your training out. However, if that is your go-to solution for a lot of these attacks, I would challenge you to sort of reconsider how you can support that training with other elements as well.
Yeah. I had one other one for you, which was the reporting side. I've seen in quite a few implementations where you have a button that kind of kills the dodgy message, because it used to be grab the message and forward it, which for me was like playing with a live hand grenade. So what do you think of best practice around, having, I think some folks have sandboxes that you can move tricky emails to.
So the big red button methodology is sort of what we always call that sort of top level of having a report button to send an email to SecOps or security operations. For me, I'm quite skeptical of it, if I'm honest, for the simple fact of you're sitting there as an employee, you've got a mission critical role, you're not sure what to do with this email. Yeah. And quite often it can take hours, days in order to get an answer. And what we see, a lot of people lose frustration and will just action it themselves and be it on their head. And it always seems to be a high amount of friction with that. And I know a lot of our research has been like, how can we simplify that down? Because that's creating a lot of work for the admins. It's creating a lot of friction for the user. It's not particularly secure because that email's landed without any mitigations in place already. Yeah. So I think historically in the early days of phishing, it was a good first stab. I think we've gone past that now. It's
kind of meeting the target, but missing the point a little bit. We've got a question in, which I'm keen to get to before we time out. So this was, would it be fair to say that all companies should have a policy to ensure basic understanding of cybersecurity should be a prerequisite? So that's I suppose that policy, if you don't meet it, you're going to have to demonstrate some kind of understanding. But I suppose I'm just trying to imagine the opposite of that. I mean, if you're part of your kind of driving license to use a computer should be understanding the sort of the 101s of cybersecurity and good practice. What do you think, Jack?
Yes, I think it's sort of a key thing. I think in principle, I agree, but I'd be cautious of weaponizing it, because what we don't want is for cybersecurity to be hostile for users.
That psychological safety point, yeah.
Exactly. So I think I would agree with it on the high level, but what that looks like from an implementation point of view, because it's important that all organizations have that, because the supply chain is becoming a bigger sort of landscape, bigger risk element. It always has been, but more so than ever before. However, to your point on, sorry, what was the term you used for it again, John?
The psychological safety.
Psychological safety. I'm going to write that down because I think that's a fantastic way of putting it.
I'm fighting with the lights, by the way. Yeah, that's not my phrase. That's a thing. Yep. So yeah, psychological safety is a good one to look up. Yeah, sorry, go on, Jack.
No, absolutely. And the psychological safety fallout, because I think it's really important that we empower and enable our users to come on this cyber journey with us, with very big safety nets underneath them that give us the control, visibility in order to perform the function we need to in our organizations. And that's an incredibly fine balance between it. And I think it will go down to each organization of what's right for you. because that's not going to be right for the law firm next to you or someone in a completely different vertical. And that's where you need to be empowered to dig in and find that out.
There aren't 10 things you can do in all scenarios. It's got to be tailored and it's got to get the right context and everything. So I'm just thinking we're a minute over. I'm sure a lot of people will be dropping off because they'll be in their calendars for meetings that follow, etc. But we've covered off. I think we've really covered off the carbon and the silicon elements. We've talked about some emerging trends and some recommendations. And in terms of resources, and folks might want to, look a bit deeper. I mean, we've mentioned National Cyber Security Centre. Are there any other places that you'd recommend folks might want to look at for resources in terms of things to do?
Recommend looking at the organisation I work for, Egress, where we've got a lot of solutions to a lot of these problems, but also we've got a lot of material in blogs and digging into each of these sort of scenarios of how do you handle supply chain compromise and other areas in more detail. I think along with that, the thing I would always ask everyone to do when doing research on this is being very, very heavy with your scrutiny about terms, where just because we say, for example, business email compromise, there's 6 different definitions for this, depending on who you ask. So it's always important to dig down.
Be inquisitive.
Further. Exactly.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining. This talk's been recorded, be available to view anytime. And also, Jack, massive thanks to you for your insights. I really enjoyed the discussion. And I hope some folks will get some value out of this and follow through. And please, I think from Jack and I, please get multi-factor authentication on as quickly as you possibly can.